Okay, our next speaker on the agenda is Ning Wang, who will talk to us about how China became capitalist.
Thanks to China, now we have a reunited States of America. And indeed, China plays that role so well that we tend to forget that trade and war are actually two different games. One is a game of mutual gains, according to no less an authority than Adam Smith, and I may add Doug Irving here. And the war is a game of mutual destruction, according to Sun Tzu. That's the military strategist of ancient China, and whose book, The Art of War, you can purchase from Costco. I did last year. So if those frame or phrase, trade war, taken seriously, that would paralyze us into something like a Puritan's donkey, right? One is something we should eagerly embrace. The other is something that we should stay away from. But anyway, the story of China is too important not to get it right. So we should be grateful that Bob Lawson included China in today's program, so that we don't lose sight of the big picture of what's been going on there. What happened in China over the past 4+ decades is nothing less than extraordinary. Say 1976, that's the time when Mao died. China was one of the poorest countries in the whole world. Everything was rationed. Everything, including basic food items. But over the past 4 decades, there are very commonly used statistics saying that 800 million Chinese people climbed out of poverty. And the poverty rate cut from over 90% to 2%. And today, wealth is created in China faster than anywhere else. There is a common saying that 2 billionaires minted every week now in China. So this is a remarkable story. And I'm going to quote here, Time magazine put it, "This is the story of our time. It is our story, everyone's story, not just China's." But any story about China is incomplete if it leaves out one big factor. China is a country with 1.5 billion people. So any wealth divided among 1.5 billion people going to become a minuscule drop. So I just said, if we compare, say, GDP of China versus US, from 2000 to 2018, China's GDP grew from 12% to 66% of US GDP. So today, China's GDP is about 2/3. But if we compare GDP per capita, China today is about 15%. So that put China on the same bar with countries like Mexico, Turkey, and Brazil. So literally, China is still a developing country. So that's the basic picture about China. So China has come a long way, but China still has a long way to go. So given the remarkable progress China made in the past 4 decades, how did China do it? And the story is actually quite simple. The story of China is a story of entrepreneurial revolution. The economic rise of China is a story of market overstate, is a story of pragmatism replacing ideology. And here I have a number of publications. Just by the title tells you the nature of the Chinese market transformation. Particularly, I want to call your attention to the second book, China had been capitalist for a long time, even before the term capitalist was coined. But today we don't have time to go that back to look at Chinese past to understand what we can learn from that past. Today my talk is going to be focused on what's happening in China over the past 4 decades under Deng Xiaoping until to the current Chinese leadership. But this is not, I'm talking about China. The story of China is a story of market transformation. It's a story of entrepreneurial revolution, and a story of capitalist revolution. But this is not the story you are told. And in China, the Chinese government presented the reform as a statist program, everything designed and implemented by Beijing step by step. And Chinese people understand it, why their government want to project itself as the hero that managed the economic rise of China. So the government program or government propaganda about reform has met very skeptical ears in China. Here in the West, the media recently come to this term, state capitalism. This is the old term, recently recycled, and people think that term holds the key to understanding the nature of Chinese economy. I have some quotes from the media in the West. But here, as elsewhere in life, what's get us into trouble is not what we don't know, but what we think we know isn't so. It is true that the state, the Chinese government, still plays a big role in the economy. You can see it, you feel it every day. And the government still runs a lot of state-owned enterprises, and some of them have made to the Fortune 500 list. And the Chinese government is also a very avid investor. If you've been to China and you're amazed by the new infrastructure there, the new airports, harbors, high-speed railways, skyscrapers in all cities across China, you have to give some credit to the Chinese government. We can fault the Chinese government on many grounds. The reason why the media here paid so much attention to that term, state capitalism, because if you compare China with other leading economies today, the state play a much bigger role. But actually, to understand China itself, what happened to China over the past 4 decades, what made China today, you have to compare China today versus what China was 4 decades ago, over the past 4 decades, right? That historical comparison, if you do that, the picture is very clear. At the beginning, the state was the only employer. There was no private firms. And today, the private firms, private sector contributes over 2/3 of the GDP, 3/4 of innovation, and over 90% of the employment. So China today is definitely a private sector driving economy. And it's very important to emphasize that the development of the private sector was not something designed or even expected by Beijing. At the beginning of the reform, of course, as I said, the state was the only employer. There was no private firms. And the private firms were allowed at the beginning of the reform because the state sector couldn't solve the unemployment problem. It couldn't create enough jobs. So that's when private firms allowed to exist. And once that gate opened, private firms quickly outperformed state sectors everywhere. And that whole process, during that whole process, what Beijing did was, to gradually take its hand off and allow the private sector to grow. And of course, along that process, a lot of new laws have to be written, new regulations have to put into place to allow the private sector to grow from basically zero to what it is today. So in that sense, it's very fair to characterize the rise of China as a capitalist revolution. But if you want to, if you like looking for what we call here night watchman state in China, you're going to be disappointed, since the Chinese state is there. And as I said, the Chinese state running the state enterprises and is a big invest in the economy. But it's very important to emphasize that the state was a central planner under Mao, under socialism. Today, the state is no longer a central planner. He's an investor and he's a capitalist. You talk to American entrepreneurs doing business in China, they will tell you the Chinese state is more capitalistic than certainly than California, the state of California. But the state is active in China, but it's active not as a central planner, but as a capitalist, as a business. Of course, different from private businessman, but it's kind of a business undertaking. And so the one, I guess, example of the success of the Chinese private entrepreneurs is the Fuyao company, recently featured in the American Factory. That's just one of many, entrepreneurs in China who helped to, transform China from socialism to capitalism. And behind the economic rise of China is the explosive growth of capital. Particularly, I want to emphasize one factor here is human capital. Human capital today, of course, is a very actively researched area in economics. But before that happened in the early 1960s, gentleman Frank Knight emphasized in that book, in an article in 1935, that human capital, he used the term human capacity, economic capacities of the people, account for 3/4 of the U.S. stock, of the total U.S. stock capital. And even before that, Irving Fisher in 1907 emphasized human capital as the most important capital in the whole economy. And he used the term human capital. And today there's an estimate of U.S. Human capital. They put the number as like 700 trillion U.S. dollars, in contrast to 45 trillion dollars regular physical capital. So you can see the huge role played by human capital in the economy. And if they take into consideration Chinese population, their work ethics, and the growing number of Chinese graduates, PhDs, and the number I don't have, but you can see the number for China's human capital is a huge number. And over 90% of that talents employed by private sectors. They make China capitalist. But the students of Chinese economy puzzled by one big problem, that China seems to apparently has achieved economic growth, but without good institutions, that private property rights, independent judiciary, political freedom, and so on and so forth. So how those institutions we regard as a precondition for the working of the market, right? This is the puzzle that troubles students of Chinese economy, and the puzzle remains unanswered. Is, I think, a good reason why we have a lot of misunderstandings, including the myth of state capitalism, and in China it's called the China model, which runs like that because China has a enterprising party, so the party be able to devise some kind of reform program that defies the basic logic of market economics. That institutions, required for the working of the market. This is old wisdom that go back to, Adam Smith, Hume, if not earlier, but brought back alive with much higher clarity by economists like Ronald Coase, Douglas North, and others during the last quarter of the 20th century. Institutions are important, but institutions are never perfect. And the market never requires perfect institutions to allow it to work. Perfect institutions never exist, and fewer institutions remain perfect. They always change. The quality get better or get worse, right? When institutions get better, that fire the spirit of entrepreneurs and stimulates the economy. With the retreat of good institutions, that diminish economic expectation and chokes the economy. So we economists say is the institutions matter at the margin. When institutions getting better, that helps to stimulate the economy. And China, by any means, even today, doesn't have good, perfect institutions, but the institutions have been improving a lot over the past 4 decades. And it's that improvement and China's continuous search for better institutions that provided, the institutional foundation for China's economic growth. So there's no need for terms like, state capitalism or, China model. So to conclude, I'm going to call your attention to a quote from Wells. This is a British author, Herbert George Wells. I don't think this is a name you guys are familiar with. But he wrote this in the aftermath of the World War I. And so I'm not going to read this quote, but the basic message is globalization is our future. And this, I guess maybe 5 years ago, I don't need to emphasize that message, that globalization is our future. But I think today we need to emphasize that message. And today, I guess, because of technological innovation, our world is far more connected, and human destiny more intertwined than Wells could possibly imagine back then. Even though he was known first as a science fiction writer, but we have a very common misunderstanding about globalization, and that is, I think, is a root cause for a lot of false expectation about globalization, and also a lot of criticism against globalization. That is, we tend to think that globalization leads us to converge to one standard, one set of values, or one set of institutions. That's never going to be the case. Diversity is the law of life. But division is deep, very deep in our human nature. So how to flourish from diversity without falling prey to division, that's a human struggle. And that human struggle admits of no once and for all solution. And that permanent human condition is a great source of human suffering, from domestic violence to international war. But also that's the reason civilization is possible. And that's also make our future open with unlimited potentials, as long as we are wise enough to bridge division and bargain a way forward. Thank you. So this is the book tells more about how China became capitalist. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you. I would encourage everyone to visit China and take a look at what's going on. I went there with my wife, who speaks Chinese, and with my family not long ago, and it's amazing. However, the experience of walking across the border from Hong Kong into Zhejiang, one of the first things that happens, of course, is the Google on your phone stops working. Gmail stops working, Google Maps. And that's quite a striking experience. You go all over the world and this doesn't happen. You've set out I think very convincingly, this path from poverty, oppression, totalitarianism in the 1970s, gradually more and more freedom, more and more capitalism, more and more markets, and more wealth. Do you see that continuing? Or is your sense that in the last few years, maybe the tide has turned back and there are more restrictions?
Absolutely, your observation, I agree. I have the same kind of experience. I have two daughters, 11 and 6. So I took them to China almost every summer. They hated that they couldn't access, YouTube, Gmail in China. And I couldn't use my Gmail in China. Certainly, the historical trend is pretty clear. The state is on its way out. The private sector is taking over. But in the past 4 or 5 years, there is indeed a reversal, particularly in political reform. And this crackdown on what we call the market for ideas is true and is disturbing. But even so, the market sector, the market economy is still growing under a lot of strain, particularly after this trade war with the United States. But I'm just by nature, I'm optimistic. So I think China will somehow find its way back to more market economy, more open society.
Professor Wang, thank you. Fascinating. I've had an opportunity also to visit China and spend time in Beijing and Shanghai, and I'm very impressed by the overall economic growth that you pointed out so articulately. However, Douglas North and other economists also point out that there is no long-term true development without good institutions. So, therefore, how can China pull itself out of the middle income trap without those institutions? Thank you, sir.
Very good question. And this is a question, I guess, troubles the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang now. This is, as I mentioned, Douglas North was a good friend of mine. So I knew him personally. So he'd been China many, many times. And among new institutional economists, there was quite some time period that they thought their ideas was proved wrong by the development of China. Because China, as I said, didn't have and still doesn't have good institutions in place. But we have seen the growth. As I mentioned in my talk, we should not look at institutions statically. We have to look at the development of institutions. And from that perspective, China has more growth, more development in institutions in any other country that you can find. So that explains the growth of the Chinese economy, the institutional foundation. Moving forward, so the reason why I remain optimistic about the Chinese future, because China achieved so much without good institutions. So, and there's a huge room for improvement in the political as far as political institutions are concerned. So and also that's reflected in GDP per capita. So there's huge potential for China to grow as long as China can, I guess, working toward find a better political foundation for the market economy.
Can you talk a little bit about the differences between the cities and the rural area? I add that my trivial understanding is that a lot of those cities are really free trade zone enterprises, but that my understanding is in the rural area it's much more restricted. Do you see that? Comment on that.
That was the case, I would say, 10 years ago. I'll just give you one personal example. I grew up in a village in South China, Hubei province. So when I was in the 80s, I went to Beijing for college. So at that time, so I first had to take a bus. It's about 6 hours if weather good. Otherwise, it's going to be 8, 9 hours to the provincial capital, Wuhan, and then purchase a train ticket. So that's another 20 plus hours to Beijing. So in 2012, my hometown had a train, fast-speed train. So today, Beijing is 6 hours away from my hometown. The infrastructure that the Chinese government put into place, changes life for millions. Another good example is the Guizhou province. This still is the poorest area in China, mainly because of the lack of transportation. It's just a mountainous area and very hard to get in or get out. Now, because of highways, high-speed trains, China become more and more integrated, domestically as one common market. And that, of course, given the Chinese population and growing, purchasing power, China, the huge market, is becoming bigger and bigger. And if you just look at the middle class, China's middle class is bigger than American whole population. So that's why a lot of, I right now currently live in California, firms there, they think their future is in China because that's the huge, market as far as their products concerned.
Thank you very much. I know I also spent a lot of time in China. But do you have any insight into what currently is going on in Hong Kong and how it can be resolved? This is tremendously disruptive.
What is happening in Hong Kong is a tragedy. I was a student in Beijing from 86 to 90. So I was in Tiananmen Square during that time period. So I very sympathetic, and I think I can understand their cause, people in Hong Kong, for their fight for freedom. But on the other hand, nowadays, I have friends living in Hong Kong. Now you see a lot of insane violence, really random violence against people. So this is very bad, and here in America we don't see that part of the demonstration in our media. But that is true, as true as their fight for freedom. So individually, I mean, yes, like young teenagers, like 15, 14 years old, high school students, they are the main people, on the street. So they are worried about their future. Mainly, this is my interpretation. Mainly because if you compare Hong Kong versus Shenzhen, 10, 20 years ago, Hong Kong way better in terms of anything. But nowadays, Shenzhen, the GDP is higher, more than Hong Kong, and people in Shenzhen sees more opportunities. And the college graduates of Hong Kong University, that's the best university in Hong Kong, their starting salary hasn't changed for 2 decades. Versus if you compare that situation, that stagnation with what's going on in mainland China, they have very reason to feel they don't have a future. And that's these economic, the lack of economic opportunities, at least perceived by the teenagers, the high school students. That's the main driving force behind this protest. But certainly their fight for freedom is true, and I as I said, I 100% sympathetic with them. But also, it just reminded me what happened during the Cultural Revolution, when violence, can rationalize under various names. This is bad. I mean, it's very hard for Hong Kong nowadays just to get rid of that, moving out of that dilemma. And I don't think anyone have like a magic solution to that problem, because the students nowadays on the street, they couldn't control themselves. They are not organized as at all. Most of them just volunteers, spontaneous, join the protest. And even if the government right now want to have a dialogue with the protest, they don't know who to talk to. So that's the problem. And I have friends living there are really very saddened by the news they pass on to me.